Welcome to the Reaching Up Podcast. I'm Ron Farris.
And I'm Daniel Locke.
And this week we are talking about anger.
Yes.
All right. So let's get going with a definition. I know we are doing our research. Merriam-Webster, the old faithful, says that anger is a strong feeling of displeasure and usually of antagonism, a threatening or violent appearance or state. So, again, a feeling. The Encyclopedia of Psychology says that anger is an emotion, just like anxiety, just like joy, just like all the things that we've been talking about in terms of emotions. Anger is an emotion characterized by antagonism, there's that word again, towards someone or something you feel has deliberately done you wrong. That's a very interesting way to look at it. That same Encyclopedia of Psychology says that anger can be a good thing. Mm-hmm. It can give you a way to express negative feelings, for example, or motivate you to find solutions to problems. But excessive anger can cause problems like increased blood pressure, and other physical changes that are associated with anger that make it difficult to think straight and harm your physical and mental health. So once again, sounding a little bit like anxiety, I guess I have misunderstood these two. So what do you think about anger? How would you define anger?
I think an emotion is a good way to say it. I think sometimes we'll label emotions as either a negative emotion or a positive emotion. And you can say that anger is most times is in a negative context, but I think it can have some positive outcomes to it if controlled well. So here, I don't want us to limit ourselves and say we're trying to get rid of certain emotions and we're trying to just do some emotions and get rid of others. But like if we can control anger well, manage ourselves for it, we won't be afraid of anger. Our anger will not hurt people. I think that's what we want to be understanding. I think that's why we want to understand anger, and so we don't let ourselves hurt other people because of our anger. But we can still experience anger, and in a non-sinful way, in a non-negative way, we can still let it be used by us.
I love the phrase you just used, in a non-sinful way. We're going to look at, of course, I'm sure you and I both are going to bring up the conversation about Jesus and his anger that he expressed on more than one occasion. Yep. So back to the baseline, anger is an emotion. You can't get rid of emotions. Yeah. Emotions are going to happen because we are human, and that's a good thing. You know, a part of people coming out of addiction is that, you know, as I've heard it said, you know, well, the good news is you're going to feel your emotions again, and the bad news is you're going to feel your emotions again. Yeah. Because a lot of people use addictive processes, whether it's alcohol or drugs or sex or, you know, gambling or, you know, 196 other recognized forms of addiction in our world. They use those things to suppress the feelings, and all that means is that they don't like or don't want to feel or don't know how to cope with the emotions that they're experiencing, and anger is definitely one of those. Interesting, you know, I talk about my emotions wheel. I had a therapist to give me a big wheel with probably 150, 200 different words on it, and as it turns out, those are emotions, and they're sort of like chartable. And it's interesting, I noticed, I was looking at my emotion wheel, and there are variations of anger on my wheel. Okay. Being humiliated, being let down, being bitter, mad, aggressive, frustrated, that's one you hear a lot, distant, critical. All of those things are variations of anger. So when you hear somebody say, I'm frustrated, they're really saying, I'm angry, you know, I mean, bottom line. Or when they're being critical, they're being angry in a form. And it's interesting because on that wheel, you're going from emotion to emotion, and anger falls between the emotion of being fearful and being disgusted. So from going from fearful to disgusted, you go through the territory of anger. So I like to think in pictures, and that sort of helps me to sort of place myself, on that spectrum when I am actually experiencing anger, because you said this a second ago. The most important thing about anger to understand is that we're going to have anger. Anger is going to happen whether we want it or not. The question is, how do we handle it? Yeah. And so the first step in handling it, and you said this is to be aware, to be self-aware of the fact that you are experiencing anger. Can you remember a recent experience you had where you had that very thing happen to you by chance?
Yesterday.
Okay, that recently. Okay, yeah. Tell us about it.
So I think we've talked about it. We talked about it a little bit in our manhood episode, but I want to emphasize and remind listeners that anger is a secondary emotion. Mm-hmm. So it's oftentimes in response to something. It's not just, well, I'm just angry, right? I'm angry because I'm embarrassed. I'm angry because I'm sad, right? And so anger helps us not feel the emotion that we want to feel. Mm-hmm. Just as everything you mentioned before, like drinking, alcohol, like all different things like that can also, those more numb the feeling, whereas anger expresses it so we don't have to feel it. Mm-hmm. And so anger is the check engine light of your soul, right? So when we feel it immediately, I'm like, all right. And I'm glad you said all those words on the emotion wheel. We have a pillow with that emotion wheel on it. My wife's a counselor, and so I'm aware of it. I don't do a good job with it. I know. I lucked out in that way for sure. But it's all those emotions. When I say I'm frustrated, when I say that, usually I don't think it's socially acceptable who I'm around. Maybe it's church people, maybe it's work people. I don't want to say, man, I'm angry right now. Mm-hmm. But if I say frustrated, they're like, oh yeah, he's frustrated. That's okay. But if we say angry, you're like, you shouldn't be angry.
Yeah, frustrated is a really overly used word among men. Mm-hmm. I've lost track. In a given week, I'll bet I hear it, 25 times. Some friend of mine will say, I'm just frustrated. Yeah. And what they're saying is they're angry. But if you tell them they're angry, they'll disagree with you. They'll say, no, it's not that. I'm just frustrated. And I'm thinking, well, okay, fine. If that's the way you want it. Mm-hmm. But really and truly, they're dealing with anger. And well, let's take a look, as we are wont to do, at Scripture. And before we talk about Jesus, I want to go back to the very beginning of the Bible. We looked at Genesis chapter 1 in our first episode, in the creation of man. And Genesis, being the first book in the Bible, sets out sort of the history of mankind from the very beginning as you walk along. So you get up to chapter 4 in Genesis, and you have Adam and Eve, who have committed the first sin, the fall of man. They've been cast out of the Garden of Eden. They've had children, and they've had 2 children, Cain and Abel. This story is in chapter 4. It says, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain, guess what? Cain got angry. Mm-hmm. And it says, he was very angry, and his face fell. Yeah. You ever experienced that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But here's what happened in verse 6 of chapter 4. The Lord appeared to him, the Lord being God, said to Cain, why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is to have you, but you must rule over it. Now, in my mind, that is the first lesson that we're given in the Bible about anger. And God acknowledges that anger is going to happen, but then he immediately notices that anger causes us to react in ways that may not be good for us. And so that's a basic lesson I think you and I can assume, that today, if I begin to experience the emotion of anger, I need to be extremely careful how I handle it. Mm-hmm. And the way that God characterizes it, I think, is an incredible picture. He says, because it is crouching at your door. Sin, which sin is just falling short, missing the mark, failing to do the right thing when you know what the right thing is to do. So failure, if you will, is crouching at your door when you're angry. But then he says, but you must rule over it. Now, we've talked about the fact that God gave mankind free will. You and I have the choice to do the right thing or to do the wrong thing. So when we get angry, we have a choice to make, essentially. Every time we get angry, we have the choice to handle it well or to handle it poorly. So let's talk about ways that we can, in the moment of anger, like you said, something typically happens. You're in traffic and, that fellow church member cuts you off in traffic on the way to church, right? That's one of my favorites, right? They're driving like a wild person on their way to church. And I'm sorry to say I see this more often than I should. My job is to not be that guy. But I'm at the grocery store and somebody jumps in ahead of me in line. And all my illusions about anger are in traffic. It's funny, but you're trying to get on the highway and somebody's just determined to get around you. And my first inclination is, well, you're not going to do that. Well, that's not really that is a form of anger. But I'm not thinking rationally. What I should be thinking is, well, look, dude, if you want to get around me, let me get over so you can get around me. Let me make this easier for you. But we don't always do that, do we?
No.
All right. So what happens to you when you have a moment of the experience of the emotion of anger? How do you handle it? I know there's not one rule that fits all because it depends on the context. So let's say you're in traffic.
Okay, and we'll stick with the traffic example.
you see somebody coming up, you see them coming behind you, and they're just flying. They're breaking all the rules. They're driving like a wild person. I know you've never seen this in this area, but they're driving like a wild person, and they're about to be right on your tail, and you're in their way in the fast lane. What do you do? And why?
Well, sometimes I brake check them. But usually I don't.
And that's an act of love.
That is,
right?
yeah, absolutely, for sure. No, I think that has changed because I would used to get angry. I'm like, look, I'm already going like 10 over. Like, you should be okay with me being 10 over because for me that's risking it because I've gotten a ticket in the last 3 years and I'm still traumatized by it. But I'm going 10 over. That should be acceptable to you. You're still tailgating me. I'm going to get angry. Right. So usually I'll pull over. A lot of times I try to assume good intent. Right. That's something I heard about. It was in the context of marriage counseling, but it was assume good intent. Assume they have some kind of emergency that requires them to be somewhere.
Oh man, you're really nailing me now because I never go to that one first. I'm sitting there thinking, who is this person?
You asked the best response. You didn't ask my response. You asked the best response.
Okay.
So, just trying to have an understanding of all right. I'm going to. And this is when I do it correctly, which is not all the time. But I'm going to humble myself and say, all right, this person's rush is more important than mine is, right? We might be going to the exact same place. I might know them and I know where they're going. And I think that it's more valuable for me to get there early, right? Maybe I'm more important at the situation we're going to. But if I have the idea of, okay, this person, I'm going to choose to let them be more important. I'm going to choose to move over and let them pass because they need to, or I'm just going to allow that rather than escalating and then getting over. And as soon as they get over, I'm going to floor it and get behind them and then tailgate them, right? And that has been my response sometimes. I'm not going to say I do it well every time. I'm saying that's when I do it well. It looks like that. And it looks like, and I'll go back a little bit because I was talking about when we experience it, like I'm getting better at it. I'm still not good at it. Getting better at, okay, when you experience anger, what's causing it? Is there what's the reason behind it? That helps a lot. And rather than, and so when we were talking about being frustrated, right? We say frustrated when we really mean angry. Because if you say I'm angry to your boss, right? You don't really want to say that to your boss because they may not appreciate that. They may be like, well, why are you angry, right? And then it's but if you say frustrated, like, all right, well, I understand that we have those days, but if you say angry, it's immediately like that's unacceptable. And so I think it's this idea that anger is an unacceptable emotion, just as anxiety is an unacceptable emotion. And if I share that, I will be looked down on. I will be labeled as something It's it's unacceptable emotion, even though we're absolutely feeling that. And I feel, you can feel angry at work, right? You feel like, and we don't have to think about anything big like a promotion that you got gypped from. Like whatever it is, it can be something that you feel strongly about. But if you have a feeling that you can't say I'm angry, a lot of times it's because that's going to be unacceptable and that's unsafe. And so we're not trying to water men down and say don't feel these emotions. We're trying to say, hey, we need to feel these emotions. We need to know that we're feeling these emotions because you're going to feel these emotions. And so if you can label and say, all right, I am angry. And if you can tell, like for me, that helps when I can tell my wife, like, hey, I'm angry. And sometimes I know why and sometimes I don't know why. But if she just hears me say, hey, I'm angry and I don't know why right now and I'm trying to figure it out, but just so you know, I'm angry. She already knew I was angry. But for her, that's almost, it creates safety for her. And you can do it in any relationship. It doesn't even have to be a marriage relationship. Like, hey, man, I'm a little angry right now. I don't know why I am. I'm trying to work that out. But just so you're aware of that.
I watched a guy do that at lunch a week ago. A gentleman that had created a scene that morning was trying, several hours later at lunch with the same people involved, was trying to sort of rehash what had happened. And it was constructive there for a minute, but then he started being critical of one of the people that was involved. And this gentleman got angry. And I watched him do exactly that. And we're all sitting at lunch in a restaurant, and this gentleman says, look, I need to just take a time out. And I need for you just to, let's just change the subject. And I don't want to talk anymore about this right now. We can talk about it later, but I need some time just to collect myself. And I sat there. It was a very awkward moment. But at the end of that lunch, I was thinking, that guy handled it exactly right. The gentleman that was pushing the issue dropped it. And we went on and we talked about something else. I think he actually changed the subject himself. And that to me was a great example of how to handle, a situation where you are becoming overwhelmed by your emotion of anger, and you just want to preserve the relationship and just put a pin in it until you can have a chance to process it a little better. Yes. I think that's a great example of how to do that. Well, now let's look at another example of how what I would call righteous anger. You mentioned this a minute ago. You mentioned the fact that Christ got angry. God got angry too. There's no question about it. There are several discussions about that in Psalm 103:8. David writes, "The Lord, which is God, is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." But God does have an angry side, but he is slow to anger. He is considering, like you said, all of the things that he knows about us. And he's taking that into consideration, and he chooses not to just move straight to anger. Yeah. That's a beautiful thing. A great example, though, of how to handle anger the right way came from Jesus, the Son of God. And the story in John 11 is where John, who was one of Jesus's disciples, one of his closest friends, one of his three sort of inner circle guys that went everywhere that Jesus went, and wrote down a lot of the things that nobody else wrote down about what Jesus said and did. John tells us about the way that Jesus behaved when one of his best friends, Lazarus, died. Yeah. And Jesus is out of town when Lazarus gets sick and he dies. His two sisters, Martha and Mary, send word to Jesus to come and keep Lazarus from dying, but he doesn't come, and Lazarus dies. So Lazarus is dead, and he's in the grave, and everybody is around there mourning and carrying on as they did in those days when somebody died. And Jesus finally arrives, and in John chapter 11 at verse 33, we pick up with the story. When Jesus saw her, being his sister, Lazarus' sister, weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, it says, Jesus was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Now that word, deeply moved, are the words that are characterize deeply moved is a Greek word called embrymaiomi. Don't quote me on that. But according to Strong's Greek lexicon, that is essentially a word that is akin to indignant. Indignant. And it uses that same word again. It's again translated deeply moved, but the word is this embrymaiomi. And it says in verse 38, after he gets past this point where he confronts them initially, where they're all weeping and carrying on, and he is greatly moved, deeply moved. It says, then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb and saw the cave and the stone laid up against it. And again, this word seems to mean that Jesus was in essence indignant, which implies a state of anger. Now, why do you think, I'm going to put this one on you, why do you think Jesus experienced indignance or anger at those moments? Any guesses? It doesn't tell us, but what do you think? And what can we learn from that?
I think Jesus was hurting, and I think it shows that later on, right? So in 35, one of my favorite verses to write down, if I had to write down it, I like pick 3 verses and write down, I was always going to 11:35 because it says Jesus wept. And as a kid, you're like, okay, it's just the shortest of the verse in the Bible, you can win trivia, right? But that one in my mind is very telling of what's going on, right? So he comes and right before that verse, they say, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. So there's a sense of, in my mind, trying to put myself in Jesus' shoes, dangerous spot, I would feel powerless to an extent, right? He knew what was happening and he knew what would happen, but there was this sense of wish it didn't have to happen like that. To me, it shows his humanity side of him. It shows that he does care about us deeply, even if certain situations are painful to us, right? He saw her pain. So I don't know. I see he felt powerless in the moment because of the hurt that sin causes, and the reason that death was not in the original design, and it's a symptom of our sin, right? And so he knows that both of those things should not have happened. So this pain is unnecessary. It's still happening, but it's unnecessary. And then he's even said he weeps, right? And like, I don't know, if Jesus is going to be the strongest person and can control his emotions, and like he is angry, but then he's also going to weep, right? And I think that's where, when I read this, I think, okay, we had a pastor growing up and he would say, hurt people, right? And so in this case, he's lost someone dear to him. Basically, put yourself at a funeral, right? Tempers tend to flare after a funeral, or if you know somebody who's had somebody close to them pass away, like their anger can flare up. And it's not an excuse for them, but it is an explanation, right? They are hurting, and so the emotions are strong. So that's kind of how I see this verse, is like he's seeing things that should not, he's seeing people hurting for reasons they shouldn't be hurting.
Yes, I agree. And Jesus was the Son of God, but he was fully human. And I recall that I've heard all my life and psychologists write, or I guess the people who are smart write, that grief follows any loss, and the first stage of grief quite frequently is anger. And so Jesus was experiencing human emotions, and he experienced anger here, just like he did in the temple when he went in and cleared out all the money changers because they were desecrating the house of prayer. Now that's righteous anger that is justified by the fact that it is handled in a proper way. And Jesus at Lazarus's tomb may have been indignant because of what was happening, but he didn't lose control. In fact, just the opposite. He was very much in control. He knew that these people were suffering, as you said, because of original sin, because, and he was indignant, I think, because of the condition that man was in to have to suffer like this. But then what did he do? He prayed, and he thanked God that God had already let him know what he was going to do. And then God raised Lazarus from the dead. and he walked out of the tomb.
Yeah.
But not before Jesus experienced some of the most powerful emotions that a man can suffer, including weeping. Because I think we would all agree that when it comes down to, I say a lot of times, well, in this situation, it's either laugh or cry, and I cry a lot. I'm sorry, I laugh too, but I do cry a good bit because sometimes I just don't want those. I've learned what damage it does to me to keep those emotions bottled up and not let them out. So I let them out, and sometimes it comes out in tears. A friend of mine used to call those liquid prayers, but all right. So one last thing here on anger. So you've got righteous anger, and you've got that example of Christ that, we and God, that we can have a form of anger that's based on the fallen condition of man, or the depraved manner that people are living. But then there's your and my anger. And, we're men. Well, our friend James, who was the half brother of Jesus, wrote about this. And we're going to.
One of my favorite books.
We're going to close with this one probably. But James, in his one book in the Bible, toward the back of the Bible, in James 1, says this in verse 19. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And that slow to anger goes right back to that quote that we had in Psalms, right? God is slow to anger. He says that we should mimic that, and that we should be slow to anger, that we should try to control our response, our reaction to our anger by trying to slow it down and process it. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
Yes.
Now, would you and I both agree that, sometimes our anger can get us into trouble, right? When I'm in traffic again, and this person is behind me, and let's just use your example. I know who they are. I know that we're both headed to the same church service, and they are just driving like, a bat out of hell, right? And they are going to run me over, and they're putting other people in peril. And I am thinking to myself, my job here is to X.
Yeah.
All right. So fill in the blank. Ron's anger says, I'm not going to let him around me. I'm going to put him in his place. I'm going to help humble him.
Yeah.
And that, what is that going to do? It's just going to make the situation worse. I've seen people react in very unpredictable, erratic, dangerous ways. And guess what? That's a thing. Road rage is a thing. There's actually, if you get a ticket in Louisiana, you pay to watch the video so they don't put it on your insurance. That video takes about 10 minutes or 15 minutes and talks about road rage. It's a serious problem.
How do you know about that, Ron?
Well, because I had that very experience just recently, and I'm not angry about it.
Yeah.
But long story short, anger is something that can be, in some instances, righteous, but in many instances, with you and me as just normal human guys, it's a great opportunity for us to make a big mistake, and so we have to be mindful and slow to anger, be prayerful, and hopefully we come into that moment of anger in an attitude, that we know that God is in control, and with that attitude coming in, the anger is not as big a deal as it would be if we were just sort of working off our emotions, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I love these verses because these were super powerful to me as a kid, right? I was very angry when I was younger, like really around 10, 11-ish. And so I have these verses. My oldest brother, he went on like hiking trip or something with ROTC. And he brought us each back a rock, of all places. He probably wasn't supposed to do that, but he did. But he wrote on there our names, the meaning of our names. Like Daniel means God is my judge. And he wrote on that the verse, and I don't know why he wrote the verse. He might not know why he wrote the verse. But he wrote James 1:19 and 20. And so I memorized, that was one of the first verses I memorized was, my dear brothers and sisters, understand this, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And so I like James because James is a very do this this is the right thing to do. This will help you. He doesn't explain why it will help you, but it just explains it will help you. So in the verse, it says, are you quick to listen? Are you quick to hear the other side of the story? Are you slow to speak? Do you just fly off the handle and start saying what you want to say? Or are you slow to speak, and are you slow to become angry? Is the first thing you hear that you don't agree with, you don't like, do you get angry? Or do you try to hear all of the other side of it, right? So this goes a lot deeper than just this verse, but this verse is very, very helpful. And then 20 says, for human anger does not accomplish God's righteousness. So even at a very young age, like I had just become a Christian. I knew that sin separated from me from God and I needed to be saved, but I did not know much about God or what that was going to look like. So that was very early. So this verse was very important to me, and it helped change me. And so as I've come to know it, I'm like, all right, this verse is way deeper than James knew it was when he wrote it. And so everything we're talking about of our anger and knowing how to experience it without it hurting someone. That's the biggest thing. Experience your anger, but don't let it hurt someone, right? Be honest about it. Be aware of it. It will help you have empathy and patience with people who are angry. If you know, like, hey, that person probably isn't angry at me, they're angry at something else.
Right.
It's not an excuse. I don't want this to be an excuse to people, well, I'm angry because I'm stressed. Well, I'm angry because I'm sad. That's between you and the Lord at that point, but it's not an excuse to do that. It should be something that helps you understand it, but it's not an excuse. And I think we excuse it a lot of times for men to be rageful because they've got a lot of stress on them, they've got a lot of whatever it is, fill in the blank of an excuse. And this is not an excuse. This is very much our responsibility as men, as women, both, but especially as men, like, because we're usually known as being the rageful ones, right? And so this is not an excuse to say, well, because of these things, because I'm a man, I can be angry and it's okay. And I can yell at my kids. I can yell at coworkers because because I'm the boss and I've worked hard to be the boss. And so no one's going to tell me I can't experience something. And so I think it all wraps up like, we're not going to say don't be angry. That's what I don't want anybody to hear this and say, well, I'll just be good when I'm not angry. Like, it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be anxious. Let's say that real quick. We need to be able to experience those emotions in a healthy way. We need to be honest with ourselves, because both of those will hurt us and they'll also hurt other people. And I think if we say that and we say, okay, since they're not unacceptable, I'm not going to be afraid of them. I'm going to seek to understand them because they are strong and they will influence how we treat people. And so if we can do that well, I think we can be careful and we can protect those around us if we do that well.
Well, I could not agree more. And with that, we are going to wrap up anger and get back out in traffic and see if we've learned anything. Right?
Sounds good.
So what are we going to talk about next week?
I think we should go with fear.
Fear.
A lot of stuff will stem from that, so I think that'll be a good next one.
All right. Well, fear it is then. So thank you for listening to the Reaching Up podcast. If you're on YouTube, be sure and hit that like button for us. While you're at it, subscribe and tap that bell button so you'll be the first to get our next episode. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to follow us so you never miss an episode. Check us out on Instagram and Facebook. On Instagram, it's at reaching_up_podcast. And on Facebook, we are Reaching Up. If you want to reach out to us, the email address is contact@reachinguppodcast.com. Thanks for listening.